She knew, she was the only one who knew what it was like to be bombed night after night after night, to think all the time that you're going to lose everything, your friends, your family, your house, your city, your country. She knew the terror, the horror of that like no one else. And she also knew that it was really down to her. She was the last one of that war generation on the international stage pretty much by now. That it was up to her really just to keep going on about it, saying, you cannot let this happen again. We must stop it. We must get together and stop it.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Winston Churchill had a daughter-in-law. Her name was Pamela Digby. In September of 1939, after war has been declared by Britain because of the violation of the sovereignty of European states in alliance with Britain, there is war between London and Berlin, the beginning of the Second War in Europe. A dinner in September after the declaration between Randolph Churchill, son of the man who is now at the Admiralty and will be the very famous Prime Minister, goes to dinner with a young woman named Pamela Digby, who is 19 years old. At that dinner, Randolph Churchill says, "Will you marry me?" Having never met her before. We learn later that he's asked a number of young women to marry him because he believes, along with his generation, in his regiment is going off to war to die the way their fathers did in the First War. The surprise is that Pamela Digby says yes. I welcome the author of Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's astonishing life of power, seduction, and intrigue, Sonia Purnell. Sonia, congratulations. It's a scene like no other. Hollywood wouldn't dare make up such a scene. Who is Randolph Churchill at this time? Who is Pamela Digby? And what is the result of their impetuous decision? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Well, Randolph Churchill, the only son of Winston Churchill, you're quite right to say he was at the Admiralty at that point, not yet Prime Minister. But Randolph has been brought up to believe that he too is destined for greatness by his father. He's been a rather indulged young man. He's often rather drunken, he gets into brawls, he can be obnoxious, but he can also be supremely charming. But what he has, of course, is this great entree into high society in London, the political world, the military world, the worlds that young Pamela Digby is desperate to enter, having been brought up herself as a young aristocrat, family rather cash strapped and down in Dorset, far away from anywhere. She wants the bright light. She wants intellectual fulfillment. She wants to be part of what's going on here. Now there is this war going on. She's desperate to play a part at the center of it, not to have to go back to the country house where her family resides. And so she's asked out to dinner at Quaglino's, a restaurant that still exists, by the way, in London. She goes along, her friend has urged her. She doesn't know Randolph Churchill at all. She knows that her parents disapprove of the Churchills, and particularly Winston. They think of him as a sort of rather chancy political type that they wouldn't want their daughter to have anything to do with. They don't believe in all the warnings that he'd been sounding about Hitler. Or if they do believe them, then they'd rather not think about them. So this is not something that her parents want her to do at all. But she agrees to dinner. Randolph ignores it practically all the way through, except by the time they have coffee, he swings round, looks at her intently, and says, "You look healthy enough to bear my son. Will you marry me?" And the most unromantic proposal, perhaps, but she says yes. And why does she say yes? Because he offers her that chance of escape from Dorset and that doorway into what she thinks is the most exciting lifestyle, really.
Let's go to Dorset. It's March of 1920, the birth of Pamela Digby. Mom and Dad are always important. It's been said to me more than once that your parents' marriage is the dinner party you can never leave, so we'll attend it here. Pansy is her mother. This is the firstborn, and Kenny is her father. He's Coldstream Guards veteran. Both Pansy and Kenny have survived not only the First War, but the epidemic, the flu, and they live in a house called Minturn, which has, strangely, more than 50 rooms and no bathroom, because that was considered unhygienic, I guess, at the time. It's on 1,500 acres, as I recall, and it's very far from town. A dirt road takes a while to get there. It takes a whole day to get to London. Growing up as the eldest child, they wanted her to be a boy. Did they raise her as boyish? How was she raised?
They expected her to be a boy, being the firstborn. I don't think they raised her as a boy. I think it was more that she saw that boys had all these advantages that she didn't. Pansy and Kenny went on to have 4 children altogether. The third one was the only son. And it was quite clear right from day one, he was the one who was going to inherit Minturn, was going to inherit the land. But perhaps even more important, as far as Pamela was concerned, was going to be sent away to school, to have an education, to have expectations of him. She was brought up in a class and in a generation where it was thought that women who were too well educated would not be attractive wives and that she would never be able to find a husband. So until much, much later, when she was allowed away for about a year, she was just educated at home by governesses who were barely educated themselves. And she really, her spelling was pretty bad. Her math was atrocious. She grew up a young woman with a very, very keen mind, but knowing that men had all the chances and all the money, and how on earth was she going to satisfy this very good brain that she had, which had not been trained in any way?
Her mom and dad take her to Canada, I believe, at one point, and she meets an older man. He's in his 30s, so would have seemed ancient at her age. And she flirts with him and learns the power that she has with men, with older men. I believe at some point she was with males her own age and she found them immature. How did she find that first flirtation?
Very exciting. He owned a newspaper in Canada, and he wanted to hear what she had to say. He obviously thought she looked radiant and beautiful, and they went riding together. But also he was interested because she had been sent to be finished, as they used to call it, in Munich. I mean, most bizarrely, in 1937, a 17-year-old girl had been sent off to the headquarters of the Nazi Party. So she had met Hitler very briefly in the Englischer Garten there. She had seen the stormtroopers in the street. She knew what it was like and how terrifying these things were that were going on in Germany. And here was a man who was not only attracted by this very young woman, but also intrigued by what she had seen. This was thrilling. This was someone actually who was interested in her brain. And that was what really inspired her to think, well, maybe there is a way into an exciting and fulfilling life outside Dorset with an older man who wants to talk about the things that I want to talk about.
The connections that Pamela Digby leads me to are blinding. I just wrote down some of the names here. The Mitfords are there, the Churchills are there. Good heavens. Sonia's mentioned the dictator Hitler in 1937, supremely powerful, surrounded by Nazi, National Socialist, Hitlerite, German Wehrmacht officers. That's 37 and 38. The whole of Europe is gripped by fear of war. Remember, this is a generation that was devastated by the First War. They don't want to go back to war. They'll do anything. And that explains a deal of Chamberlain and the reversal of fortune that Chamberlain suffers because of Hitler's deceptions. Pamela's watching all this as a teenager. Now, something important, there's an important event. I didn't write down the date when, as a debutante, she comes out and she has a number of days, it's understood, to find a husband. And she meets the king and queen, and then there's a number of dances and parties where you're supposed to match with a young male of your class and your education and your ambitions. But it doesn't happen for Pamela. Why not, Sonia?
No, it doesn't. And you're right, by the way, to mention the Mitfords. It was Unity Mitford who introduced Pamela to Hitler. But yes, it was 1938, which was a very glittering season, considering what was going on not that far away. And you have about 6 or 8 weeks to hook a husband, as they saw it. You're on a marriage market. And Pamela failed. She failed because she was a little rounded. You were supposed to have a 17-inch waist, and she didn't. But much more important than that really was that she didn't play that sort of, coquettish game that others played. She wanted to talk about Hitler and things that were going on. And the young men who were around and who she was supposed to be matching up with certainly didn't want to talk about him. And so she was seen as a bit of an oddball and rather pitied. And she met Kit Kennedy at this point. That Joe Kennedy, then obviously the American ambassador to London, brought his family across. Kit was also JFK's sister, obviously, was also involved in that season. And she saw Pamela being a bit gauche, a bit different, a little bit plump, and described her to Jack as that stupid, fat little buttleball. So, and that's how people thought of her at the time. By the way, Kit Kennedy later changes her mind completely. They become very, very close friends. And she sees that Pamela, in fact, is extremely well versed in pretty much everything. But those initial impressions were as just someone who was a bit of a joke, as Nancy Mitford put it. And so, no husband, a complete failure at the end of that season. And Pamela is a bit adrift, to be honest.
The book is Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. Sonia Purnell is the author. We've seen already that when Pam had the opportunity to marry, she took it to a man she didn't know, and she is quickly going to learn it was a road that maybe she might have avoided. However, Sonia, they marry within days of the proposal. At a church that was later, I believe, wiped out by the Blitz, but all that's in the future. They exit the church under the cross swords of Randolph's regiment. Her father, Kenny, is in uniform. It's all very splendid, except the Randolph secret. Not very secret. He drinks too much, way too much, and he's a philanderer. Does she know any of this when they walk under the swords?
Well, a lot of people warn her, hoping she will pull out of the engagement. But in a way, Pamela's one of those people that the more you warn her of something, the more she wants to do it. And she didn't ever really like changing her mind about things. She's pretty stubborn, really, even as a young woman. And anyway, what's the alternative? To go back to Dorset, which she really doesn't want to do. And so she takes a gamble. It is a really big gamble, but she doesn't want to lose face either. So she marries him, and it pretty quickly becomes clear what he's like, that he drinks too much, that he philanders, he is abusive. Even their first night, their wedding night, he stays up all night reading out loud to her from books and then asking her questions about them. There's history books and things to make sure that she's been paying attention. I mean, he's not someone who's really given her any, thought as to what she might like or any kind of romance. He wants to shape her into his ideal wife and not really listen to what she would like.
There is the suggestion that we can go down the pathway of figuring out the Churchills at home, but there's too much ahead of us, so we will not pursue that. Clementine and Winston meet their young daughter-in-law. Winston is charmed, but her job is to produce the heir. They don't doubt that the baby will be a boy, and that's what Winston wants. When does she start to talk to Winston about what he's interested in? This is the Admiralty. Do they sit together? They play cards together. Is that when he talks to her about his day?
Yes, they play Bezique, a game that she was very good at, by the way, but I think she quite often let him win for, harmony reasons. She starts talking to him about what he's interested in, which is politics and the war, obviously, pretty quickly, because that's also what interests her. And now she has this great window into it. And it's also pretty clear that her marriage is going nowhere, even though she's pregnant quite quickly. And so the Churchills, Winston and Clementine, invite her to stay with them at the Admiralty, and then quite soon Downing Street when they move there, when Winston becomes Prime Minister. And it's interesting because as they push Randolph further and further away, they don't trust him. They don't trust that he will keep secrets. They don't trust him to behave properly. They bring Pamela closer and closer in. And she very soon, and this is really remarkable, becomes part of a tiny, tiny inner circle called Padlock. And they share all their secrets with her. And she knows everything about the conduct of the war. And when Harry Hopkins gets sent over by President Roosevelt for the first time to see what's going on in Britain, is it savable? Does it deserve to be saved? He meets Pamela and he decides that she is the best plugged in, the most plugged in person in Britain after Churchill himself. And that's what he advises people back in Washington. So he sees that she really is the apple of Churchill's eye. And what's even more interesting is that everyone else sees within a few days, she becomes the apple of Harry Hopkins's eye too. She's charmed him completely. And by the time he goes back to Roosevelt in DC, he's saying, we've got to save these people. We've got to do everything we can to save them.
In the meantime, Randolph, just a note, Randolph has a regiment, the 4th Hussars, that I think was his father's regiment. What do you do when your dad rides with Kitchener to Khartoum, or shoots it out with the Afridis, or races off to Cuba to cover the war, meets Teddy Roosevelt? What do you do with a dad like that? Well, Oedipus has an idea. Randolph's idea is to be indifferent to people's opinion of him because he's special. However, Pam tries very hard to be what he wants. She tries to fit herself into the box, especially during her pregnancy, which is all during 1940. This is clearly the most bombed pregnancy in history ever recorded, because all the time that she is morning sickness turns into a condition that makes her very frightened of losing the baby. The Germans are sending wave after wave. She's recording all this, and your book makes it very clear that the drama of 1940 is not entirely about what was going on in Europe or what was going on in Downing Street. It's also about the way people lived their lives under the Blitz. And I got the feeling, Sonia, they became used to it. Is that correct? We just have a few seconds.
They found a way to live with it. And that way, you know, might surprise people to hear this, was not to be on their own, to party, to try and live as colorfully as much as they could, because you might be dead in 10 minutes. A bomb, there was one place, Café de Paris, a bomb came down a ventilation shaft and decapitated the singer when he was mid-song. Everyone in that cafe was killed. So anything, it was supposed to be safe, by the way, it was in a basement, but anything could happen to you any second. So people live life to the full, and that included Pamela, particularly when she'd had the baby. But you're right to say, I mean, she lived in London through the Blitz, whilst heavily pregnant, and gave birth during a huge air raid.
Sonia Purnell is here. Her new book is Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. This time with Winston Churchill, and now the 1940, and the baby is born, named Winston. And now the Americans, in December of 41, are going to enter into the war and save Europe, save the world, is the opinion at the time. However, there's a very important figure who's shown up to be supervising Lend-Lease, $42 billion transfer of equipment from the Americas, FDR, to Britain to sustain them through this period when America doesn't want to go to war. Remember, Europe didn't want to go to war after the first war experience. Well, neither did America. And FDR is aware that he can't force Congress into war with Germany again. They felt lied to or deceived by Woodrow Wilson. All those politics are going on while our heroine, Pamela Digby Churchill, is watching this and struggling with Randolph's drinking, with Randolph's philandering, with Randolph's abuse. All of that is happening simultaneously. And then the man in charge of Lend-Lease turns up. His name is Averell Harriman. He's 49 years old. And what does Pamela think of him, Sonia?
He's the sexiest man she's ever seen. And she also knows what she's got to do. She's willing. to do it. And what she's got to do is help enlist Averell Harriman to the British cause. He is the man who can help bring the agony of war to an end. He is the man who will deliver the message back to Washington as to what Britain most urgently needs, whether that's food or ammunition or ships or planes. So his understanding is vital. His sympathies she has to help, bring him round, as I say, to the British cause. He is thought to be rather an aloof, a cold man, but also someone who has a sort of an insecurity beneath that rather suave exterior. And so she is sent off in a special war uniform to meet Averell Harriman. That war uniform, by the way, is a gold lame, skin-tight, shoulderless dress. She looks phenomenal. Since she had the baby, she slimmed down. The excitement of her new life makes her look radiant. She goes to a dinner party. It's all been orchestrated, it's all been choreographed. A dinner party at the Dorchester Hotel, where she is placed next to Averell Harriman at dinner. And she starts what she calls her mating dance, which is to kind of stroke his forearm, look into his eyes. She had the most beautiful sapphire eyes, laughed at his attempts at repartee. He wasn't a very witty man, but she made him feel like a god, like a king. Then there was an air raid, and he says, let's go downstairs to talk more easily. But they didn't do much talking. They went down to his suite where it was a bit safer on a lower floor. And as she said later, that was a very fortuitous air raid. And as he said later, there's nothing like the Blitz to get things going. And sure enough, the next morning, I think it's fair to say he was recruited to the British cause wholeheartedly. And by the time he went back to DC sometime later, people thought he'd been bewitched. He was so pro-British all of a sudden. That was Pamela's work. None of this was an accident. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was willing to do it. Averell Harriman was probably her chief target, but there were many others thereafter. Influential Americans with the ear of the president or a kind of sway over American public opinion. So she became Churchill's secret weapon. Not only was she enlisting them to help the Brits, she was also finding out information from them about military priorities in Washington, the thinking in the White House. And all of this information would be channeled back to Churchill in Downing Street, often over cards. Again, that game Bezique plays a real, role in all of this, often late at night. And she would say, this is what I hear, this is what's happening. And this information was also vital. But she helped solidify that vital Anglo-American alliance, because don't forget, there was nothing back then like what we call the special relationship now, or some people call the special. None of that existed. Those back channels didn't exist. And what she was doing really was helping create them for the first time.
Max Beaverbrook, always a mystery to me until your book. Max had a conversation with Pam during and before and after this seduction. Max was a gossip monger, I think he's called, and she was his bird dog. So not only is she reporting gossip to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, she's reporting gossip to equally powerful man, the press lord himself, who's also in charge of munitions at this point. And Max learns a great deal about where FDR is, where that's all going. And the Winston and Clementine knew of the liaison, use the French word. Max knew. Was it general knowledge at the time, or was this considered state secret?
It wasn't quite a state secret, but you can see the potential for scandal here. So it was kept within certain circles. But what was a state secret was that she was doing it for patriotic reasons. I mean, I think she found Averell Harriman very sexy, very attractive. She was totally willing to do it, by the way. Her marriage was clearly in ruins. Randolph had by this point been sent off to Cairo, get him out of the way, I think was the thinking. But, this was something that was really important for the war effort, and she was happy to do it.
The liaison with Averell Harriman is much regretted by Harriman at the end of his life. But at this point, he has a wife, His wife is very strong-minded, and he will not leave her for a 22-year-old married woman who happens to be related to the Churchills. However, Pamela Harriman has other liaisons, and one of them, I believe, is introduced to her by Kathleen Harriman, who comes over as, you'd have to say, cover for her father, who carries on. Kathleen and Pamela live together, as I recall. Is that when they live in the Dorchester Hotel? I don't remember.
No, by this point they've moved out of the Dorchester Hotel into an apartment. But they do. She does provide cover. I mean, Kathleen pretty quickly cottons on to what's happening here. But it's obviously a lot easier if she's around, and that's an alibi, as she puts it.
And Kathleen introduces them to other Americans. The media, of course. What else? And not just the media, not just newspapermen, but that modern device that changes the nature of the war, radio. One particular CBS star, Ed Murrow. Ed Murrow is a married man with a Quaker background and assumptions about his life. And Pamela challenges them. He falls deeply in love with her. What does he make of her at the time?
He's passionately in love with her. I mean, partly it's because, she has the allure of being so close to power. These reporters know just how powerful. They have a pretty good idea of just how powerful she is, just how close to the Prime Minister she is. So she has that allure, but she's also an unbelievably sexy and unbelievably clever young woman. And he just absolutely falls for her. He's a kind of stern critic of the rich and the aristocracy, but at the same time, he finds them fascinating and alluring. But also, Ed Murrow has a great influence on her because he once said to her that he wanted her to go and eat and drink in pubs like normal people, that she's had a very sort of privileged and protected life, and he wanted to introduce her to a different way of thinking. But of course, once again, she had chosen strategically. Ed Murrow was this unbelievably famous war reporter. CBS had this great influence. It was beamed into the sitting rooms of all of those American homes. And what Ed Murrow said on his broadcast from London was incredibly influential. Often he is credited with America privileging the war in Europe for a while over the war in the Pacific, despite what happened at Pearl Harbor. And so she's feeding him tidbits of information for his broadcast that she knows will peddle or help to peddle the British cause. And meanwhile, she also targets his boss at CBS, Bill Paley, but also some American generals, including Major General Frederick Anderson, and some people involved in intelligence like Jock Whitney. But all of these men are strategically chosen. But she was handling all of them at the same time, if you can imagine, and somehow avoided scandal, avoided jealousy, or mostly avoided jealousy, certainly avoided any falling out. So she was a woman in her early 20s who was picking up all this intelligence, was handling these men with big egos and under enormous strain, and kind of, managing them extremely well and doing her job extremely well while she was still in her early 20s.
The divorce happens. Randolph is unrepaired. I note that oftentimes you have several scenes where Winston is really, really rattled by Randolph's bad behavior. And Clementine will take to her bed too, but that relationship, the son to the father and mother, is sad to watch, given their conduct during the war. To know that they were in pain like that is hard. However, Pam gives them joy, and she's very pleased to continue that conversation. At one point, we come to June 6, 1944. Did she know before everybody else? I couldn't tell at that scene. Did she get the call that the invasion was on before it was announced?
Yes, she did. Oh, certainly before it was announced. Yes, she did. I think it was General Anderson who first tipped her off that morning that it was going to be that morning. But also she knew, because all these powerful men that she had been sleeping with was suddenly all extremely busy and not able to come round to dinner anymore, and had to be, occupied with something else. So she knew it was happening, and she also knew from Churchill how important it was and how terrified he was that it was going to fail. And this really, really haunted him, the idea that you might see tens and tens of thousands of young men die for no success at all. I mean, victory came after D-Day, but it took quite some time before it was clear that it had been a complete success.
Sonia Purnell, my colleague and guest, is the author of Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. This is the same Pamela Harriman you think you remember in the news and the Clinton administration, same one, but the war is now done, and Pamela Harriman's skill of taking really good information to Max Beaverbrook so he can gossip about it, and to Winston Churchill so he can act upon it, comes to an end. There's no longer a need to know what the Americans are thinking. The Americans are taking over the world. And Pamela goes to the world. Now, quickly, because there are a number of high points here, and we need to get on to the 1960s and her introduction into being an American wife. Pamela is most taken, of all the men you introduced me to Agnelli, Gianni Agnelli. Who is he?
He is the young heir to the Fiat empire, that Fiat, the car corporation, the biggest corporation in Italy. But obviously the Italians had fought on the wrong side of the war, and Fiat had prospered greatly from supplying tanks and trucks to both the Italian and German armies. He has a lot of rehabilitation to do for his own name and for Fiat's name. And it is quite likely that the Allies are going to confiscate Fiat altogether. So he also has to persuade London, but even more importantly, Washington, that his family should keep hold of Fiat, because that will be a way of stopping communism really kind of taking a huge foothold in Italy. So he has a lot of explaining to do, and he's a young man. He has no idea how to do this. And he meets Pamela. Now, there is instant attraction. I mean, a huge attraction there. I think of all the men she's ever with, Gianni is the one. But this is also a transactional relationship. She can help him learn how to operate on the world stage. She's learned all of that from Churchill, and she certainly does. And he becomes rated by people like Henry Kissinger and many other people, even though he's actually a businessman. He's not a world statesman. But also he needs to kind of convince the Allies. And Churchill will have nothing to do with him. He calls him that ghastly Italian car mechanic. But she persuades him, this is really quite extraordinary, to have dinner with Agnelli in a restaurant in the south of France. And they get on quite well. And then she introduces him to Americans, including JFK and all her other friends in Washington. And he starts to become quite powerful in Washington himself, and later great friends with JFK, actually. So she really, really helps him to kind of wash away the stain of the war years, to become someone that is rated and accepted on the world stage. And in return, by the way, she's provided with jewels so huge in her ears that when she turns her head, they sock her neck and leave a dark mark. I mean, the diamonds were that big. A beautiful custom Bentley, a wonderful apartment in Paris, and much else besides. So this is a transactional relationship, but it's also love. But it does not work out in the end.
A detail, it's important to Pamela Digby, a deal, although we can't pursue it very far, is her sense of herself as a mother to Winston, to young Winston, who is the male grandson named for Winston Churchill, who was with us until 1965. So Pam Digby Churchill is still in conversation with the former prime minister, who loses his office in 1945, will regain it in the 1950s, but these are the periods in between. And Winston always strikes me as not his father, but he was his father. It's a puzzlement, because Randolph goes on to remarry and become a member of parliament. I don't know whether his behavior gets better or not. Certainly his treatment of Pam is muted. At least that's my impression from reading the scenes. What does young Winston, the grandson, make of his mother? Does he leave? I think he's still with us. I don't think he's left us.
No, young Winston is no longer with us. I'm afraid he
Okay.
died in 2010. But um, that was a difficult relationship.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. I mean, young Winston lived with her quite a lot in London during the war. When the Blitz got too bad, he was sent out of London to somewhere safer. He didn't really see other children. Beaverbrook, I found a letter in private papers from Beaverbrook, Max Beaverbrook, to Pamela, saying that even he had been shocked when 2.5-year-old little Winston ran up to him one evening and said, "Would you have a cocktail with me?" So, I mean, young Winston was brought up in a certain way, but never really fully had his mother's attention. She herself, if she were here now, would say that she knew she was not a particularly maternal person, and that would haunt her really all her life. And she would try and compensate for it in other ways, and money and gifts and treats and things. But that relationship was always difficult. I think, if you look at it during the war, I think you should look at what Churchill himself said about being a father, or what rather his entourage would say. One of his private secretaries once put it that Churchill loved his family dearly, but his purposes, i.e. his business, winning the war, whatever, always came first. And I think during the war, Pamela saw winning the war as more important ultimately than her son. And that created a sort of a habit in a way that persisted afterwards. And sometimes they were close, sometimes they drifted apart, but certainly once he was an adult, that became a harder relationship, particularly because young Winston chose to side with Randolph against his mother, which cut her to the core.
Winston and Clementine have 3 other children, all girls, Sarah, Diane, and Mary. What is their opinion of Pamela in this period after when their father goes back in as PM? What does they make? What do they make of her?
I think there was always a problem that, that they all wanted to be close to their father. Their father was treated almost like a god. And here was an outsider, Pamela, coming in, and suddenly he was closer to Pamela, spent far more time with Pamela, talked far more to Pamela, shared much more with Pamela than any of them. That caused problems. In Mary Churchill's diaries of the time, she talked about this pang of jealousy. And I think that was always a problem. Sarah Churchill was probably the closest one to Pamela. There was a warmth between them, but she too talked of her regret that she could never be as close to her father as Pamela was. And indeed, whenever Pamela walked in the room, even at his darkest moments, Churchill just seemed to kind of feel brighter, more energetic. His spirits would lift, and Pamela always had that effect of him. But that did cause problems. But I would also say, though, that I think if you're the children of a man as great, a legend perhaps, like Winston Churchill, this is not easy.
No.
This really isn't easy. And I think they all suffered from that. And Pamela, in a way, it was more of an advantage for her. She was marrying into it, but she wasn't a blood Churchill. And in a way, that was easier.
Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's astonishing life of power, seduction, and intrigue. It is the late 1950s, 57, 58, in Paris. And Pam, at the time, is enjoying Paris in a wonderful apartment and the attention of many lovers. At the same time, she is curious indeed about America, where power is moving from Europe, recovering from the war, to Washington. And it so happens that one of her good friends, Leland Hayward, needs an additional seat for a theater engagement. She's going to be away, and her husband, Leland Hayward, will attend. And Pamela accepts the invitation. And suddenly there is melodrama. Sonia, wonderful. Leland Hayward is a producer about to discover the sound of music. Pamela Harriman, at the time, Pamela Digby Churchill, is not bored with Paris, but recognizes it no longer has the sparkle of the pre-war years. What does she make of Leland Hayward? Good evening.
Well, good evening. So she sees an attractive, rather sexy 50-year-old who's obviously doting on her. He did what many men have done over history, told her how his wife didn't understand him, how she didn't really like the theatre as much as he did, that she was always running around Europe with Ernest Hemingway and others, that he felt rather abandoned. And I think it's fair to say that Pamela saw her chance. Here was a man that perhaps she could look after. Perhaps she could help him with his career. He was American. Perhaps she could go to America and be his next wife. He'd had quite a few by this point. And she, I think, was pretty ruthless about this. She saw her chance of a new life away from Paris and in America, where she had wanted to be really since the end of the Second World War. So she set about seducing him. It wasn't a difficult project actually with Leland, and he very soon was completely smitten.
Slim Hayward and Betty Bacall look to be a dynamic duo, and Pamela celebrates her candor with both of them at a dinner in Paris. Do they know that Pamela's after Leland Hayward at the time?
No, they don't. Even when, over this extraordinary dinner in her apartment given to her by Gianni Agnelli, she starts questioning Slim about her marriage in quite some detail. And at one point, there is a phone call, a transatlantic phone call, then still very rare, very expensive. Only a few people did that. She rushes away from the table to take the call, and neither Betty McCall nor Slim Hayward realise that it's Leland. Leland is already chasing Pamela for all his worth.
Over the next X number of months, Leland Hayward finds excuses to dash to Paris, and Slim Hayward and Betty Bacall and the others. It's now Pamela's time to go to America. She makes it clear to Leland that he's stalling and he must do something. She arrives in 1959, June of 1959. There's a sensational remark about enter the vixen. America, does it know about Pamela Harriman, Pamela Digby, Churchill's celebrations in Europe? Is everyone informed?
I think a few do, and crucially, the kind of circles that she moves in. So, New York society, Washington society, they know about Pamela as a seductress and as someone who was very close to Churchill during the war. So she has this reputation. Hence that phrase you've just picked up on about the vixen entering the hen house. So I think it's fair to say that she wasn't terribly popular with certain women who feared their husbands might be drawn away, or even the mistresses of certain men who thought they might be replaced.
This is a spectacular time, the 1960s, and Leland Hayward is in search of more and more discoveries, more and more successes. Pamela opens a shop in Manhattan. Why?
Well, after she marries Leland, which she eventually does, Slim gives up and Leland and Pamela get married, she discovers gradually that he doesn't really have much money, not much money at all. The Sound of Music is a great success, but thereafter he fails time and again to find another one. Money is oozing away, including the money that she brings into the marriage. She sells her apartment in Paris, she sells the Bentley. All this cash is invested in the marriage. So money is an issue, but so is boredom. For a while, she's very excited about Broadway. This is fun, learning about box office takings, learning about plots. She tries to help Leland in every way, but really she still yearns after doing something for herself. And if politics is still shut to her, and she's very great friends with Jack Kennedy when he's president, but obviously doesn't get a proper job from him. She wants something to occupy her mind. She's one of that generation of women in the 60s who feel really constrained by society. And a lot of them were taking tranquilizers or whatever to get over this kind of feeling of just not, having a fulfilling life. And Pamela was part of that. Hence, she opens this shop. She sells kind of knickknacks. She sells the Pamela look. Everyone's fallen in love with the way she does up her apartment by now. But there's one thing from playing around with a store like that, and there's quite another thing making money from it, particularly when some of your celebrity clients, like Ethel Kennedy, amongst others, do not pay their bills on time, and a lot of them didn't.
Kennedy is dead. Pamela hears about it in November 1963. what are her thoughts? Did she leave letters about it?
She did write some letters and some thoughts down. One thing she said was that, he was my friend and I'm devastated, but it's the same for everybody. But in a way that wasn't true. Obviously, it was completely devastating. Someone else said that, we may smile again, but we'll never be young again. It was a kind of end of innocence in a way. And she had put everything into moving to America. Now America was going through this tumult, and it was quite terrifying, I think, for her. But she really had lost a close friend. They had been close since the late 1930s. And it was so exciting to go to the White House, to see the president as your friend, to hear him talk about what he was doing in power. And now that was gone. And it was a terrible, terrible shock for her. I think that's fair to say. And I think, she heard about it when she was in her shop, actually, on the radio. It was deeply, deeply upsetting.
Leland Hayward's health deteriorates all through the 1960s. At the same time, his children, especially Brooke Hayward, are openly hostile towards Pamela. What is their relationship before Leland's death?
I think his children had always felt they had never had enough of their father. He was a workaholic. He was driving himself so hard, sometimes so hard that he would literally have internal hemorrhaging and blood would just be pouring out of him almost. And they felt that so work had come first, second, and third in his life, and they'd come a very, very distant, perhaps fourth or fifth. And now he had this new wife who he was obsessed with and who knew how to handle him. She was always around. I mean, she went to great lengths to sustain his career. One of his productions, for example, she persuaded the president, President Kennedy, to come along to support it, even though this was during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet Kennedy, came along as she asked. She did everything to help him. He was very grateful, but his children were very resentful, and they were worried that any money that might be left would not go to them, but to Pamela.
Leland Hayward dies in 1971. Pamela is now a mature woman in her 50s, and the money is gone. Leland has spent it quite oddly without telling Pamela where the future lay for him and for Pamela. And we turn now to Pamela Harriman in the 1970s and a accidental meeting in Washington with a man named Harriman. The book is Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. Sonia Purnell is the author. It's the 20th century from the point of view of one extremely ambitious and energetic young woman. She's in her 50s now. She's lost Leland Hayward, and the money is gone. And she's at a garden party in Washington. Lally Weymouth's house, I believe, maybe it's Kay Graham's. Kay Graham and Lally Weymouth. Well, Lally Weymouth is her daughter. And there is a man she knows from years before. But, Sonia, is this an accidental meeting? Pamela is very good at setting things up.
Well, John, that's an extremely good question. It's always been folklore about Pamela that, yes, it was all choreographed by her, completely set up. She knew exactly what she was doing. But funny enough, Kay Graham's daughter, Lally, told me that, no, this isn't true. I engineered it. I saw how miserable Pamela was after Leland died, and I thought it would do her good to come down, to go to a party in DC. I didn't know that Harriman was going to be there. But sure enough, he was. And Pamela walked in, and there was Averell Harriman in Kay Graham's garden in Georgetown. I think it's fair to say that sparks flew all over again all these years later.
As Averell Harriman has lost his wife, Marie, and he's been despondent, and his children have worried about him. Pamela Digby Churchill becomes Pamela Digby Churchill Harriman. And at long last, the fortune is gigantic. She's in love with Averell Harriman. I'm convinced of that, Sonia, in the way she handled this. And they have their wartime experiences to bond them. No one can have experiences such as they had. And it's the 1970s. And Pam has ideas. Averell Harriman is disappointed with his life at that time. Why?
He'd been this great statesman in DC. He was really valued for his knowledge of Russia and the Soviet Union, but he'd never got as far as an elected politician as he had hoped. He'd been governor of New York for 2 years, but he hadn't been re-elected. He'd thrown his hat into the ring twice to become president and not got very far. Some people dismissed him as a plodder. I think that's unfair, but what he didn't have was that nose for the political game. So he was always, as Pamela put it herself, more of a statesman than a politician. He wasn't just very good at getting down and playing that game. And it turned out that Pamela was way better at it than him. She was able to, converse with people from all different backgrounds, make them all feel special. Averell was always a bit wooden in public, and that was just something that he could never get over. Perhaps he would have got much further than he did, by the way, if Pamela had been with him all those years. But Marie never wanted him to have a political career, and therefore was never really that keen to support him along that path.
She makes him feel like a king. Is that fair to say? Is that why the book is entitled Kingmaker?
Well, that's one of the reasons why it's entitled Kingmaker. And it was almost absolutely, she did make him feel like a king. And how she did that, one of the ways she did that was his house on N Street in Georgetown in DC. She made it shimmer. She made it look absolutely wonderful with all his artworks. But she lined the hallway walls with pictures of him with the Queen Elizabeth, with Khrushchev, with de Gaulle, with Stalin, all his great moments in history, all the great people he had met and conversed with. So it was almost like a temple to his career and what he had done, but it was also super comfortable and alluring. And it became a great meeting place for Democrats, both in and out of power, to cheer each other up, but also to come up with new policies, new candidates. And this was very much her pursuing it. He made the introductions, obviously, in the Democratic Party amongst the leadership. He introduced her to everyone, but she seized the chance that gave her. She became an American citizen so that she could throw herself into the political fray as much as possible.
The other man in her life is Winston Churchill's grandson, Winston. And they've had a difficult relationship, Pamela and her only child, Winston. At some point, Randolph has made the relationship very difficult. Did Winston recognize that his father was a saboteur?
I think Winston didn't. This is one of the great sadnesses, and there are many in Pamela's life, that she never got her relationship with her son, young Winston, onto a really good, healthy, even keel. And she tried to make up for her own shortcomings, which she was aware of, by spoiling him, buying him things, asking her lovers to buy him things. What she married Harriman, passing money on to him, even buying him a plane. But that didn't really help the relationship. If anything, he became quite resentful of that. And meantime, also, he was very aware of his Churchill heritage. He was the only grandchild to bear the Churchill name. He wanted to be a Churchill. And so he thought being his father's son was more important than being his mother's son. And when he got married in 1964, he made it quite clear by appointing his father, his best man, that he was going to take Randolph's side. Despite all those things that happened during his childhood, when Randolph would lose his temper and terrify him and just not turn up for ages and basically be an absentee father, young Winston decided to back his father rather than his mother. And this caused Pamela enormous distress.
One of the political details that Pamela discovers as Averell Harriman's wife is women are seeking a role in decision-making in Washington. And Pam Harriman, who comes from a completely different tradition, takes that as her cause. Was it recognized at the time, Sonia, that Pamela Harriman was advancing women as political actors? We have about a minute.
I don't think it was recognised. She realised that women had the only role when she entered Washington was a political hostess, but she pushed that much further by looking at policies, by looking at candidates. No one expected this, but she really did turn around the Democratic Party. And a lot of people who were around at the time confirmed that. She gave it hope, she gave it a future, she gave it ideas, and she gave it money by fundraising, mostly not her own money, but she certainly turned things around.
Sonia reminds me how ancient 1980 is. The Reagan administration that comes in as heroes, according to the Republicans, does not have a woman in the cabinet. And most amazingly, bans trousers at the White House. Is that accurate, Sonia? They really went that far? We have 30 seconds.
Yes, that is accurate. It was a conservative time. Women were not supposed to be the principal. They were supposed to be support actors. And so Pamela had to pretend that she was in the background and make out that it was all about Averell, but it wasn't anymore. He was fading as she was becoming more and more of a star.
Sonia Purnell, Kingmaker, Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. Churchill's not enough. The war is not enough. Averell Harriman's not enough. Pamela Harriman is principal in Bill Clinton's reinvention. A defeated governor of Arkansas comes to Pamela Harriman in some fashion in the 1980s, I believe in 1980 itself. And Pamela sees the future and she acts upon it. What does she do for Bill Clinton?
She makes him believe in himself again. I mean, he said after losing the governorship in 1980 that he thought maybe politics was all over for him, that he had messed it up so badly, there was no comeback. But she had this mantra, which she said to Clinton at the time, you have to fail to succeed. Failure helps success ultimately, as long as you learn from it. So she told him that, but she also realized that here was a man with a messy private life, which she understood completely. She saw that very clearly. A patchy electoral record, sure. He wasn't well known in Washington. He didn't know the right people often, although she did. But behind all of that was someone who had an extraordinary charisma. I mean, really hugely powerful charisma, but also an ability to decipher the political landscape, to synthesize policies in a really impressive way. So she didn't see a hick state governor, as some people called it. She saw someone with enormous potential who needed a bit of tutoring, a bit of mentoring, a bit of polishing, and certainly fundraising, and also someone who just believed in him. And she positioned herself back then in 1980 and for the next 12 years as that person. They became very close friends, I should add.
The TV part of their relationship. Bill Clinton instructed her how to conduct herself. You mentioned at one point she was restrained on television. How so? And what did he teach her?
Well, it's very interesting. She found TV quite scary. She couldn't see the audience. And so what she did when she was nervous would go into a sort of almost Churchillian delivery, a bit halting, a bit slow, a bit too hesitant, a bit sort of stentorian, completely not right for TV. He said to her, talk to TV like you talk to me over lunch. Relax a little, be yourself a bit more. At one point, she was even going to cancel a TV interview. She was so scared, and he gave her confidence. So this was a two-way thing here. And that's partly why they became such good friends, because they could help each other. And he could also verse her more and more into American politics, which is where she loved that world. She loved Washington, and she loved the cut and thrust of American politics, and he helped induct her in that.
She's raising money. She's using the N Street Palace as a meeting place. And on the way out, the donors have a silver tray, I imagine, something like that. Please deposit your check for $250,000. Thank you very much. See you next week. All very wonderful. But in 1986, Averell Harriman dies. He's a very senior figure in his 90s at this point. So I forgive him passing on. Pamela, however, has a moment now to take charge of the political side. And the Democrats do very well in 1986. I believe they regain the Senate. How did she see herself in the Democratic Party at that time?
I think Averell dying Was very sad for her, but it also released her, gave her much more time. She had been incredibly devoted to his care while he was, ailing and died very ill. He had cancer. After that, she had much more time, and she could see she no longer had to pretend it was all about Averell. It now could be her calling the shots, saying that the Democrats needed a really high-tech TV studio like the Republicans. The Democrats needed to have counterattack ads against the Republicans. But the Democrats also had to choose the right people, both for the House and the Senate, but most particularly for the White House. And so she had these issues evenings in her house where candidates would basically come along and basically be tried out by her in her drawing to find out how good they were under pressure, with questions fired at them, how engaging they could be, how broad-based they could be. And slowly but steadily, she became the one who seemed to call the shots as to this person is going to work or this person isn't. So you mentioned the 1986 elections being very good for the Democrats in the Senate. Sure enough, that is the case. And a lot of those successful senators were quite adamant afterwards that they owed their success in large part to Pamela tutoring them, pushing them forward, giving them policy ideas, and really just making a difference to the whole democratic electoral machine.
Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes the leader of a failing Soviet Union in 1985, I believe. And his conversation, letters, meetings with Ronald Reagan become the declining years of the Soviets and the rise of hope without a nuclear confrontation. Pamela Harriman is right inside. I have a photograph of Pamela Harriman holding Mrs. Gorbachev's hand in Georgetown, Raisa Gorbachev. Why? Why were they together, and what did Pamela say to the Gorbachevs?
This is yet another extraordinary strand to Pamela's life. For a long time, both while Averell was alive and after he died, she believed and argued vehemently that the only way to bring the Cold War to an end was to start negotiations from a position of strength, absolutely, but to start negotiations with the Russians, with Moscow, to open those channels again. And in 1983, she had travelled with Averell, then well into his 90s, could barely see, could barely hear, to see the then leader of the Soviet Union, Andropov. Andropov told them, yes, it was time to open those channels of communication once more. He was terrified of a Cold War happening, of a nuclear war, happening by accident. And Pamela and Averell came back with that message to Washington. The Russians knew the role that she had played. And indeed, that conversation didn't lead to anything immediately, but certainly alerted the Americans to a greater willingness on the part of the Russians to talk and to make concessions. That did eventually lead to a treaty where nuclear weapons were reduced, or certain type and certain section of nuclear weapons were reduced. That was an agreement between Moscow and Washington. And the Gorbachev now being the Soviet leader, a protege of Andropov's, came over to sign that treaty. And they were so in sort of awe of Pamela's involvement in bringing that about, that they wanted to single her out of all the people in Washington to say thank you. And that is why Raisa Gorbachev, who'd been invited by Nancy Reagan to the White House, she wasn't very keen on going there, by the way. She never got on with Nancy Reagan. She specifically asked to go to Pamela's house for coffee. And you see that picture that you see of them holding hands in the book was that day. It was quite a coup for Pamela. The Gorbachevs were like rock gods at the time in Washington. Everyone wanted to meet them.
The Soviet Union ends under George H.W. Bush's administration. Did she have a relationship with the Bush family, Pamela?
She did, but I wouldn't say, funny enough, I think that's one family or one sort of political dynasty she wasn't particularly close to. She had known other Republicans rather better, I think, than the Bushes by that point. So they weren't, that wasn't an administration where she was constantly in and out of the White House.
And then the decision made by Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, Hillary and Bill, to run for the presidency in 92, despite the fact that George H.W. Bush and enjoyed a near, I believe, 80% approval rating after the Gulf War. Clinton enters the fray. Many larger than life names in the Democratic Party defer their running, including Mario Cuomo of New York. And Pamela Harriman, I have to believe, was part of Bill's inspiration. Is that correct? Did she urge him on to run against a popular president?
That's absolutely right. Two things I'd say about that. First of all, she equated the position of the Democrats at that point to Churchill's experience at the end of the war. So Bush's ratings were so high because he had succeeded in the war in Kuwait. But she said the thing is, Churchill was this great war victor in 1945, and yet he lost the election because people's minds had moved on to other things, usually their own personal lives. That's where the whole idea of "it's the economy, stupid" came from, really, in Clinton's campaign. We know how successful that was. And that's how the Labour Party had won in 1945. They talked about housing and health and schools and future. The future was where it all was. And so she was very much pushing the Democrat Party towards that. Bill Clinton himself giving him belief that he could actually win. He was the right man at the right moment. And if you don't believe me how important she was, then, ask Bill Clinton, because he will say to you, oh, yeah, a very large part of the reason why I reached the White House was because Pamela Harriman helped me.
Kingmaker. Pamela Harriman's astonishing life of power, seduction, and intrigue. Bill Clinton is elected. There's a big party at the N Street address. I remember the New York Times made a big splash about it. I puzzled at the time. You've now explained it. This is gathering at the feet of the woman who inspired this victory. And the expectation is she will be rewarded. Not right away, but then Paris comes up. Does she want to be the ambassador to Paris?
Oh, yes, she does. I mean, people used to talk about her becoming ambassador to London, for example, but she knew the tabloid newspapers would destroy her, or attempt to destroy her in London, would be obsessed with her past. She thought, and this was a gamble that paid off, that in Paris, her sort of erotic adventures, as it were, would be celebrated rather than frowned upon. And to a large extent, she was right. In fact, one of the papers said that she had made the scandal of her past into an ornament. And I think Paris was rather flattered that President Clinton had sent them Mrs. Harriman. After all, she was obviously very close to the president, and she was also super glamorous. So this went down mostly. There were some detractors, some critics, but mostly extremely well in Paris. And she was very pleased indeed, but also very nervous. She knew that unlike most ambassadors, she had no high school education, she had no university education, she had no formal diplomatic experience. Obviously, she had enormous informal experience. And so she studied really hard before she went out there.
Mitterrand loved her. Chirac loved her. I don't think the French hesitated, did they? Was there those catty remarks? Were those French remarks or were those English?
Largely not French. There were a few. Some of the wives of Paris, of the wealthy of Paris, were not so keen on her returning, I think it's fair to say. But the catty remarks were, yes, they were largely not from French officials, but from others. I mean, there was one who said that she was expert only in rich men's ceilings, but if anyone ever said that sort of thing, she would pluck a UN Security Council resolution out of her handbag and then discuss the finer wording of Article 9 brackets to just to show them that she was there to be a very, very serious diplomat. Sure, she was a political appointee, but that's absolutely not something she took for granted, and she earned her position in a very, very big way.
The 50th celebration of the Normandy landing. She was a principal in hosting President Clinton. She connected the Elysee Palace with the White House. Was that appreciated by these detractors?
I think it was the start of a lot of people changing their minds. She certainly did very well. She kept the whole thing together. But the organization in something like that is absolutely huge. And also, there was this whole thing that President Clinton's presidency had started in quite a rocky way. He had a lot to prove on the international stage. This had to go really smoothly. This had to prove him to be a leader on the world stage. And she knew how important it was for her to get it right in the organization. And she certainly did. And Clinton came out of that, I think, pretty well. And in fact, I found a letter from him to her in her private papers saying that both he and Hillary were enormously grateful at the way it turned out and it had been down to her.
Bosnia, the massacres that followed the breakup of the Soviet Empire, and especially Yugoslavia. Again, the young men she met in Georgetown, I'm thinking of Richard Holbrooke and Sandy Berger in particular, were principals in dealing with the European situation, the crisis of Europe. There was reluctance on the Americans to get involved. I'm going to guess that Pamela Harriman provided the connection that was necessary for the Dayton Accords. Is that accurate?
I think she did two things. And by the way, I mean, President Clinton has said that she was a big part in our efforts, and the French have said that, her role was, quotes, invisible but decisive in all of this. And I think she did two things. First of all, she set up an incredible line of communication between President Chirac of France and Clinton in Washington at a time when normally Washington and Paris did not get on very well. Relations tended to be pretty prickly, and she got over that. She overcame that completely. She got these two men talking and liking each other and understanding each other. So that was also really key, by the way, in terms of getting a Western alliance that could potentially take on the Serbs and end the bloodshed. The other thing she did, and people like Christian Amanpour, CNN, were kind of witness to this. And Christiane's been extremely helpful. She brought a sort of moral compass to all of this. She knew, she was the only one who knew what it was like to be bombed night after night after night, to think all the time that you're going to lose everything, your friends, your family, your house, your city, your country. She knew the terror, the horror of that like no one else. And she also knew that it was really down to her. She was the last one of that war generation on the international stage pretty much by now. That it was up to her really just to keep going on about it, saying, you cannot let this happen again. We must stop it. We must get together and stop it. So she did two things that were really key, and which have been celebrated behind closed doors and hailed behind closed doors. But certainly she was a big part of it.
High blood pressure. Pamela Harriman has high blood pressure. Why that's significant is just a moment to acknowledge there was a great sadness in her life as she's in Paris, and that is the children of Averell Harriman are fighting her over the fortune which has been badly invested and is bleeding away. And Sonia, you're very clear that that was always on her mind as she conducted her life in Paris. And she told Bill Clinton after the re-election that she would leave Paris. What was she thinking at the time, where her future lay with the money leaving her?
I think this was a devastating time for her. She was under intense stress. Her closest friends and advisors, her aide, Janet Howard, said to me, it was killing her what was happening. The lawsuits, the counter lawsuits, the accusations of what she'd been up to. I think, it's now pretty much accepted that the advice she was given was very bad, but the advice came from the people who Averell Harriman had appointed before his death. Sure, she probably should have asked more questions, but she didn't. She was busy doing other things. And so these lawsuits were coming closer and closer to her, demanding more and more money. Her money was draining away. She'd invested it here, there, and everywhere. And she faced the possibility of bankruptcy at the time that she was working on the Bosnia War and many other problems too. It was too much. Her days were too long. They were too frenetic. They were too stressful. And her doctors were very worried about this. She did have this problem with high blood pressure. She tried to alleviate that pressure by taking a daily swim in the pool at the Ritz whenever she could, most days, not always. But there was one particular day where she had a terrible, terrible headache and she hadn't been right for a while. And her deputy chief of mission in Paris says, I'm worried about you. Take a break. Everything is taken care of today and go for a swim.
Pamela Harriman leaves us. Washington is shocked. Bill Clinton pays tribute to her at the National Cathedral during the funeral. 8-minute speech, I think, is what you say, Sonia. What did he tell America about Pamela Harriman in that speech?
So she had a huge brain hemorrhage in that pool. She never recovers. She dies. Clinton is obviously emotional about it. And he tells the congregation that day that he wouldn't have been there without Pamela Harriman, that she had taken part in so many great events of the 20th century and shaped some of them, that she had been an extraordinary friend both to him and to Hillary. He wanted to put to bed all those ideas that there'd been, a huge fight between the two of them. That wasn't true. And that he wanted really to sort of say that she had been a great person and that she had been misunderstood and that she had played a great part for her adopted homeland.
Kingmaker. Sonia Purnell is the author. Pamela Harriman's Astonishing Life of Power, Seduction, and Intrigue. I'm John Batchelor.